Hi folks, welcome back. This is our second week of class, and what we're talking about ultimately, we're going to be getting into the social history of marriage and family in the United States. However, before we get to that point, we do need to talk a bit about and recap a bit of what took place during the first week. And so I wanted to begin by acknowledging our favorite family shows, our favorite family TV shows. And so several shows got, in a sense, honorable mention. They got mentioned many, many times. So Family Matters being one, for instance, Sister Sister being another one. Also Full House, Fuller House, just to name a few of the shows that you all found to be important with respect to your own personal enjoyment, and also the messages rather that they ultimately communicated about family values, the importance of family. You felt that these were significant shows. My favorites then and now, we'll look at those just briefly. These include the Jeffersons, and so this sort of goes way back to my day, so to speak, the Cosby Show, as well as Family Ties. So those were probably the big three that I really enjoyed back in my day, so to speak, growing up in the 80s. Now, the shows that are family oriented or family related, although they tend to take a very different, sometimes significantly different spin on family, include Mayans, if you will. Some of you know about that show. That appears on FX. Power is another one, and the spin-off of that, as well as Greenleaf and Queen Sugar. So these are some of the current shows that I find that are ultimately rooted in a family experience that I really, really enjoy, and that really do bring forth that emotional significance of what family is all about. And so that's one of the things that in doing this exercise over the discussion board really brings home for me, and I'm hoping that it does for you, that there's enormous emotional and personal family significance with respect to what these shows grasp and what these shows communicate. So they do, again, bring that forth, that family is this emotional center, and it's a personally defined emotional space. But again, we also can see that there are limits to that as well, in that there are legal ramifications. There's the legal family, so to speak, that the book reminds us of. That blended families, Full House was an example of that, as well as Fresh Prince. Those are examples of families that have these emotional connections that may or may not be fully captured or embraced by some kind of legal circumstance, or that there may be indeed legal nuances that emerge sort of as limits if we think about some of those TV families like Fresh Prince or like Full House with respect to who was the head of the household, what parent or parents were present, if any, and what relationship did the dependent child ultimately have with respect to the family she or he was now in. So, in a way, those shows, Full House and Fresh Prince, were sort of a kind of how-to guide for how to become a family when there's really no legal or institutional precedent. If, for instance, you're being taken in by somebody who's not really a direct line relative of yours, yeah, there isn't necessarily a legal precedent for that circumstance, even though there may be social and cultural precedents for those. And we'll talk about that as we get into subsequent, later chapters. All right. It kind of makes me think of that quote that art is the lie that tells the truth. And so these shows were ultimately of fictitious situations, circumstances, and characters, but again, they ran for years. Some were renewed, or they, in the case of Fuller House, had a sort of contemporized view of what the family is like now. And so it's a way of saying, hey, even though this is not really a true actual family that we're bringing to you, we're sort of amplifying what you feel and how you are connected with respect to your own families. All right. So again, today we'll be looking at the social history of marriage and family within the United States. And again, a lot of this is really, really going to be sort of a way we never were kind of experience, hearkening back again to the great book written by the social family historian Stephanie Kuntz, which gives us a way of looking at, okay, well, here's what really happened in American history. Here are the gaps that we can fill in that go beyond some of the things that we consider to be the truth, the reality of then, which are often mythical with respect to what happens if we really scrutinize them. All right, here's some themes that we'll start with and that will have sort of anchoring us in this second chapter, in this second week. All right, keep in mind, number one theme is that family recognition and different kinds and types of family, this really ultimately is consistent with human history, that these family types and different ways of recognizing family and family members, it really greatly parallels human history. And so going back thousands of years, if we go back to prehistory, early human history, we can see that we had unique ways within which to assign family recognition, to assign and recognize unique aspects of family life. And so it's not something that was just sort of invented on the fly. It's not something that we've only had within this country or within this continent. We've had it, quite frankly, for thousands of years. Also, within this second chapter, another theme that we can look at is that there's great diversity, if you will, with respect to the family traditions and heritage of United States families. Great diversity in terms of race, class, and culture, despite the fact that there's great dominance of European ancestry and European, if you will, heritage dominance in terms of how families are considered and construed. So we'll be, excuse me, sort of going back and forth between that again, we'll be recognizing the diversity with respect to our foundations and looking at groups such as Native Americans, African Americans, but also looking at Europeans, and of course recognizing the dominance legally, socially, and culturally of European Americans, but again also realizing again that legal circumstances and aspects ultimately created that dominance, which is really artificial to say the least. Another theme to keep in mind is inequality, that there is great inequality with respect to marriage and family in our country, particularly in terms of race, class, gender, and culture. And so anytime we're looking at what may seem to be the stability of, if you will, American families and families in the United States over time, we're also looking at that which was and can continue to still be destabilizing with respect to family in terms of who has access to what resources. Where is power ultimately vested and distributed in society? How is that experienced from within families, from one family to another family? Also, trends. There are going to be many trends that kind of cross-cut this particular subject and other subjects that we have to underscore, that we cannot leave out, and we have to make sure that we really sort of clarify them, that over time we've made some shifts, and there are some trends that we can point out right here. Families have transitioned primarily looking only at economic survival to being an emotional experience and being an arena where emotional content and emotional support is important. We also have seen a trend where we've moved from patriarchal norms to more egalitarian norms, where we're looking at the transition away from male-centered, male-dominant households and male-dominant institutions to more power sharing and something that approaches egalitarian norms. Not that we're there yet by any means, but again, we're approaching those normative structures of sharing, particularly in terms of sex and gender. Also, we're looking at the growth of government and the economy. We're looking at the growth of those institutions over time and what they have done with respect to how the family has changed. All right. Also, urbanization, another important significant trend with respect to the evolution of family in our society. We are an urban society. The vast majority of people within the United States live within some metropolitan region. Typically, a significant majority of U.S. citizens live in suburbs of a major city or some kind of regional city. And so that shift and what has come with that shift has also made changes that are significant to the family. Also, another trend to keep in mind, the growth and recognition of childhood as a distinct part of life, and along with that, smaller families. And so we've seen at this time, we have about just under 2 children per family. Whereas if we went to just the 1960s, not particularly that long ago, we would be looking at about 3.5 kids per family. And so just within that 50 or so year span, 60 or so year span, I should say, we've seen a significant change in the amount of children per family. Peer marriage is also a trend. It is much more likely and much more common today, especially since the late 70s into the present, that when we marry, we tend to marry a best friend. We tend to marry a life partner, someone who has common interests, a similar lifestyle, who likes the same kinds of hobbies, and you tend to want to do these things together. If we look at past cohorts, again, particularly before the 1970s, peer marriage was not really the norm. It wasn't really something that had to happen. It was not a precondition that the married couple truly have a friendship that had true foundational roots and sea legs and so forth. Again, the notion of peers and best friends marrying is relatively new and is a trend that is likely here to stay for the foreseeable future. All right. Okay. So we need to talk again about a few things that I'll be amplifying that are part of this chapter, that are going to be in the notes for the chapter and so forth, and you'll see them this week. All right. And again, if we go back to prehistory, ancient societies recognized distinct family types. And so they gave us the foundation for how we think about unique family situations and dynamics and circumstances today. That these ways of recognizing family and family members, they sustain human life, and they also sustain society as we evolve from hunter-gatherer societies into the post-industrial modern societies that we are today. So in a way, this is sort of a way of looking at it from a evolutionary standpoint. So families were systems of individuals that adapted socially, but also adapted genetically and also adapted biologically to the environment as well. So we had to find ways to adapt and find ways to cooperate going from the prehistorical period into the present, because again, that was within a family context, especially a system, an essential system for survival. All right. Now, if we go to our American family origins, if we go to the colonial era of the late 1600s and early 1700s, we can observe some things. That, as you can imagine, at this time, European origins dominated in just about every way, institutionally, culturally, economically, and politically. Christianity, as the recognized dominant religion, heavily regulated family life, and there was significant inequality in terms of class and gender, where men, white males, overwhelmingly were enshrined with patriarchal norms, and that was ultimately the fulcrum upon which families were based. Now, if we look at the colonial era and slavery, we have to also keep in mind what was going on at that time. Our family social history in this country reflects African American, European, and Native American traditions and cultures. So here's some ways we can look at similarities as well as contrasts. For Native Americans and Europeans, both did recognize and practice monogamous marriage and also the possibility of divorce. Within African American cultures at this time, also within Native American cultures, families experienced much more sex and gender equality between partners and spouses, which continue to this day as trends within those respective communities. Among Native Americans, family connections were foundational to social structure. So family connections were a basis of social and communal life within Native American nations and cultures. Also, they were more likely to be matrilineal than patrilineal, wherein primarily they were descended from one's mother instead of being descended from one's father. So that was very common to have that recognition of matrilineal descent among Native American cultures and heritages. Right? Among Europeans, marriage was generally viewed and experienced practically. There wasn't much consideration for amorous, sort of love, romantic-based marriages. If we, again, go back to this colonial period of the 1600s and 1700s, looking at that point in time. During this time, men had virtually unlimited authority within marriage, white men, and women were expected to regard husbands with the same respect that they held for God and for religion. So white men at this time, seen as extensions ultimately of God, kind of God in the household, so to speak, and that they had to be honored in a godly fashion by their wives, right? Also, children contributed directly to the family survival. They were considered really little adults, and so they, in addition to doing household chores, this went well beyond that. They were definitely, decidedly necessary for farming activities in farming communities, and that formed a basis of survival for the community, but also within the family as well. And so you had to have a sort of all hands on deck experience going on within colonial families, colonial white families in particular. For African Americans during slavery, despite their status as slaves, most African Americans lived in families while they were enslaved. They had culturally recognized marriages, and most children lived with their parents at least at some point during their lifetimes. Within the black community at this time, balance or egalitarian norms were common. They were the norm within black communities. This equality was a limit to the equal oppression of men and women within slavery. And so there wasn't also with that one job that was better or seen as a male job versus one job that was lesser or seen as a female job. Again, we're looking at slavery, we're looking at the slave system. So there was no benefit to truly try to distinguish tasks and other kinds of aspects of slave life in terms of gender. And so without that, without separate spheres of men being in the workplace and women being in the home, and we'll talk about that in later chapters, work within slavery and within the slave system was not exclusively male or exclusively female. There weren't really those gender divides. So that division wasn't present in the labor, and it therefore was not present within the relationships. Also, one of the worst things you could do, especially under an incredibly horrific system that was inhumane, one of the worst things you could do would be to again impose some kind of gender bias within that. And so in so doing, if black men availed themselves of that, they would only be enshrining more deeply their, if you will, dominance or being dominated under the slave system. And so trying to embrace patriarchal norms would have only entrenched and made worse the horrific conditions of the slave system. Once we get to the Industrial Revolution, once we get to the late 1700s, but certainly the entirety of the 1800s and into the early 1900s, this is where things begin to change for all groups, and we often see the more dramatic changes happening for white Europeans, white Americans. The market economy changes. Capitalism really gets ushered in because you have a factory system that emerges during the late 1700s and well into the early 1800s. And so you start to see families move further and further away from the fields and move more into cities where they could work for wages in factories, where mechanized labor, machines, and crude machine technologies were taking root. And so that made things change a lot within families and within marriage, right? So this new form of capitalism where people were working for wages, where they weren't making things at home, they were working outside the home, really for the first time in this country and really throughout the world where we saw capitalism emerging. You had this separate sphere system emerge where women were recognized as needing to be at home, nurturing and providing support within the family and the community, and men's sphere and men's, in a sense, rightful place was seen as being a wage earner within the labor force. And so in a lot of respects, capitalism, although it evolved the economy, it did not evolve marriages and families. In a lot of respects, it allowed for marriages and families to regress and to go back to a much more rigid form of gender hierarchy and gender norms, where patriarchy was upheld even all the more under this new capitalist environment. Any kind of challenge or freedom from traditional values, particularly for women, was seen as a threat to the system, to the economy, as well as to the family itself. And so after time or over time, love marriage and romance starts to emerge as a kind of compromise between the expectations of traditional values, as well as the need for some kind of individuality, expression, individual choice, and so forth. And so it's a way to sort of cope with the great change also ushered in by capitalism as well. Having to work for wages, having to ensure your family's survival as a man in a different way, it was more difficult in a lot of respects to have to cope with that kind of change, particularly for women as well. And so this sort of embrace of romance and love marriage became a way to find balance and find some kind of stability and work toward a goal that would ultimately be emotionally satisfying in a time that was very, very difficult and challenging. People start to have fewer kids per family, and childhood starts to be seen as a separate stage of life. Again, we're looking at what was happening during the Industrial Revolution, during the ushering in of capitalism, where again we see more goods and services being provided beyond the family and beyond the household. Right? Also, public education grows, government grows. Immigration also was going on, obviously, at this time in greater and greater numbers as capitalism and the economy grew. And so there were fears that those coming in, immigrating to the country, would not have the basic skills for life. And so we start to see approaches to public education really form and solidified during the 1800s. And this is where we have the basic kinds of schooling systems established, and ultimately they gain some kind of permanence, if not significance, at this time. We also see benefits begin to appear and expand as well. Survivor benefits for those, for instance, who were surviving dependents or surviving spouses of someone a husband who had passed on. Government benefits were there to ensure that families would be propped up and that poverty would not become entrenched, particularly as a result of early death of the father. And so a lot of this benefit expansion happened not only by the government but also by the workplace. These sort of became the stepping stones for what we eventually would see develop into the welfare system, AFDC, as well as worker protections and workplace rights, worker rights. Now, if we go into the period starting about 60 years ago, if we come to that period, we can think of that as where post-industrial economics and post-industrial ways of living, more modern ways of living. And so by post-industrial, we're talking about what was happening after the industrial period and the Industrial Revolution. One of the ways you can think about the industrial period is during that time we had more smokestack industries, we had more factories. Much of the work during the industrial period, which dominated the 1800s and the early 1900s, much of that work was neck down. Much of it was physical labor in factories, in plants, in shops. And of course, as Michiganders and Michiganians, we know that history and that heritage well of physical labor tied to some kind of plant or factory. So once we get to become post-industrial, once we get to that period, that kind of work starts to diminish. It's not that it goes away completely, but there's a lesser need for factory work and factory-based production. Factories are still around, but they need fewer workers. Technology advances in a way that allows for automation and allows for robotics, and you also see the dispersion of plants and factories. They move more deeply into the suburbs, in and around Metro Detroit and Flint, but they also move further away into the South and, of course, overseas. This, of course, brings about great changes. A lot of this period is also called and referred to as deindustrialization. And so it's a fancy way of saying we don't have as much heavy industry, as much smokestack industries. We don't have as many factories during this point in time. And so starting again at this point about 60 or so years ago, we're looking at the growth of services and more folks working within a service capacity, providing outcomes in banking, finance, education, healthcare, and the like, just to name a few, real estate. So services become the outcomes, and they become the way that ultimately the economy is shaped and structured, formed, and how money is actually produced through services and also through technologies that eventually grew and grew and grew to what we have today, particularly in terms of the internet, as well as other kinds of technologies that are related and are electronically based. So during this time, again, starting about 60 or so years ago, during the 1960s into the present, this is where the nuclear family, so you've got the father, the mother, and their dependent children, that family dominance, we saw that more during the 1950s. That brief dominance of the nuclear family happened really right after the Second World War. That starts to shift and change once we get into the early 1960s. Women are at this point called into work more, not simply because we become more egalitarian. Some of that did happen certainly with the equality movements, civil rights and such during the 60s and 70s, but really the economies that emerged after the Second World War, especially once we get into the 1960s, the economies really just needed more workers, needed many, many more workers. And so that's one of the reasons why we see female wage earning increase significantly after the Second World War. So the economy expands and the need for services more than actual products, that grows a lot more. And then again, this is where we see much more women, more women over time significantly added to the labor force, especially during the 1970s. Also, we see government programs grow. We see welfare systems and family support systems grow much more, not only at the federal level, but also at the state level as well. And inequality grows. Poor and working class folks, we'll see, are less likely to marry today compared to middle and upper middle class and wealthy families. And so we'll be looking at that as well later on in subsequent chapters. Also, we know too that those who are college educated are much more likely today to get married, and we had never really seen that statistic emerge, but that's really something we've seen happen since the late 1990s. Again, the educated professional members of our society are much more likely to be married and to stay married and have more stable marriages. And we're seeing the truest declines in marriage amongst those who are poor and working class. And often, to be poor and working class means that if you do get married, marriage is much more complicated by the strong possibility that one or both partners will not be economically stable. And it's really because of how the economy discriminates against workers who earn low wages and are less educated. And so one thing we also can't leave out too, especially in this post-industrial period, is just how much union protections have been eroded, especially if we look at the period between the 1940s and the 1970s, that roughly 30 to 35 year span. We had much more workplace union protections and union benefits, and so wages were higher at that time, and families prospered really during those 30 or so year periods. Where again we see, especially during the late 1970s and into the present, we still have unions, but people are not as likely to be members of unions, and in so doing, the erosion of unions also means that pay stagnates. And so we'll look at this later as well. If we look at men's earnings since the late 1970s, most men, if we adjust for inflation, it's not the actual same dollars, but if we adjust for inflation, since the 1970s, since the late 70s, most men and male workers are making less than, they're making less now, I should say, than they did 40 years ago. And so it says a lot about what's happening in the economy. We see much more additional trends, globalization, technology, union decline, among other kinds of things happening. And that process does tend to erode wages, especially for those who are among the least educated within the labor force and within the workforce as well.